pertaining to the death of Reverend Florian Gao, which occurred at Somerset Medical Center on June 28th of 2003. We are also here to speak to Mr. Cullen in reference to several other deaths that occurred at Somerset Medical Center and other medical and healthcare facilities.
In 2003, New Jersey prosecutors would order in 2 detectives into a meeting room. In this meeting room was the top brass of high-ranking officials at the Somerset Hospital. They were investigating 3 possible deaths with abnormal lab findings inside of the hospital. The detectives and prosecutors in this case would start a formal investigation. They also ordered the hospital to start an internal investigation on their part and to send them that internal investigation. Now, the next day when they received that internal investigation, they were expecting a whole binder full of data and documents, but instead what they received was a very sparse document written by a lawyer. Now, in that document, it said that there was no criminal wrongdoing that they found, but they did mention a man named Charles Cullen. With not much to go on, the detectives began to investigate Charles Cullen. Now, they found some minor arrests in his history, like being drunk in public. They also found that when they talked to family and friends of Charles Cullen, that they were not at all surprised that he was being investigated. An elderly woman named Helen Dean, who was accompanied by her son Larry Dean, would enter a Warren County, Pennsylvania hospital to have a minor procedure done. The procedure went perfectly fine and she was scheduled to leave. Now, during that visit, Larry, her son, would report that a male nurse would come into the room and ask him to please leave as he pulled the hospital privacy curtain around behind him. Larry was out by the nurse's station when he heard his mom yell, "Ouch!" and he rushed back into the room. He asked her what happened, and she would say that the nurse pricked her with a syringe. Very shortly after that, his mom would pass away, even though she was perfectly fine. So that made absolutely no sense to Larry. He would draw the conclusion that she was murdered, and he would take it to investigators immediately, saying that the male nurse that had entered the room was the person responsible for her death. Pennsylvania police would look into the matter and test her body for all types of drugs, except one in particular, digoxin. But the case was actually closed for lack of evidence in Warren County, Pennsylvania. Now, our New Jersey detectives looked into the matter and they would investigate at that hospital that it happened at. But they would learn that the documents for that case were actually destroyed by the hospital.
You familiar with Reverend Dowell's medication history?
In general terms, yes. Meaning I had taken care of him a couple weeks before.
Did there come a point during his stay at the hospital that you yourself were his primary nurse?
When he was over in the ICU, I took care of him for a couple of days in a row. But then I hadn't taken care of him since then for after that. So I was taking care of him. I'm not sure how many days I took care of him, but I took care of him a couple of weeks before he passed away.
Okay.
Charles Cullen had a lengthy career as a nurse, and he actually worked for over 16 years across 9 different hospitals in multiple states. This was not the first time that colleagues that worked with him had grown suspicious that he might be doing criminal wrongdoing in the deaths of some of these patients. Now, one nurse would recall that she had 2 different patients that were doing perfectly fine and they were very stable. Then all of a sudden they coded and would pass away, and she found this to be very troubling. So she decided to investigate the matter herself. She would compile as much data as possible with the patient records and find out what doctors and nurses were working, how many shifts they were on, and everything to do with cases of deaths around that time. And she found that there were 67 deaths in that time frame that she was looking at. And based on how many shifts that Charles was working, she thought that statistically, he might be around the vicinity for 17 of them. Now, she found that he was actually there around the scene for over 40 of them, and she thought this was statistically impossible because it was more than double what she thought was possible, and she found this to be very troubling, and she thought that Charles was involved. So she took it to the board of directors and the higher-ups at the hospital to report it. But they just brushed it off and told her that they had already investigated it and he was cleared of any wrongdoing. Now, after multiple attempts trying to get her bosses to listen, she actually would take it to investigators and give them the case. Another case featuring a good-hearted man named Florian, who was actually a priest. Now, around 2 a.m., he called his sister and he reported to her that he was having trouble breathing. So she advised him to go straight to the hospital and she would meet him there. While at the Somerset emergency room, his condition actually worsened and he had to be incubated to become stable. But eventually his condition got better and he became stable. So it came at a great surprise when all of a sudden he would actually die and pass away, tragically. This confused the doctors because he was in great condition again at the time.
After you withdrew the digoxin from the system under another patient's name other than Reverend Gao, correct?
Yes.
What did you do then next?
I went into the patient's room sometime later that night or morning and gave the medication to Reverend Gall.
How much digoxin did you withdraw from the Pyxis system before administering this to Reverend Gall?
I don't remember exactly going by the Pyxis entry. It said 2 amps, but it was probably more. I don't know if the count was off from the beginning, but it was probably 3 or 4 amps.
And what was your intent when you withdrew this? Why were you drawing this out?
The detectives were a bit out of their element because the medical field can be very complex. So they called the poison control officials in New Jersey to ask them some questions about digoxin. And while they were on the phone with the poison control official asking questions about digoxin, the official would reply, "Are you calling about Somerset Hospital?" As if he had already known. And they said, "Well, what are you talking about?" And then he would reply in response and just know what was already going on about the cases that they were actually investigating. So they would rush down to the poison control lab to talk to him personally. One of the first things out of the poison control official's mouth was, "Where have you guys been? You guys should have been here months ago." He would go on to explain exactly how digoxin worked. So digoxin is used to treat heart failure, and it helps the heart to beat more strongly. Now, as the levels of digoxin in the blood rise, the heartbeat actually becomes more faint, and eventually you die. As it turns out, the poison control official had raised the alarm to investigators about the matter, but it didn't seem like anyone had listened to him for months. Now, the investigators were trying to put together a case for Charles Cullen, but they could not arrest him based on rumors and hearsay. They needed something more concrete in the evidence department. So they called the Somerset Hospital to try and get help and get more evidence. They were referred to a woman named Amy Lund, who worked in the risk department of the hospital. Now, the risk department is responsible for, among other things, they're kind of like a lawyer, and they help the hospital to avoid liabilities so they don't get sued, because this can be a very sue-happy type of industry. They would ask her for the Pyxis printouts of what medications were given to the patients. She informed them that she had given them everything that they had at the hospital, and the Pyxis printouts only stored 30 days worth of information about who got what medication. Detectives found this very troubling and very confusing. Medication must be tracked because it's highly regulated. So instead of having an employee hand out medications to the doctors and nurses in the inventory room, they had a Pyxis machine. And the Pyxis machine is like a vending machine in dispersing medications to the doctors and nurses. So basically how it works is they go into the Pyxis machine, they type in what order of what medication they want, they hit enter, and out pops a box that disperses the medication. Obviously, tracking medications is very important. We want to know which doctor got what medication at what time to put together, if he gave it to this patient or if he maybe kept it. It's very important because these medications are highly regulated and can be, in some cases, very dangerous. So the detectives found it very troubling that this Pyxis machine would only store 30 days worth of data. It didn't make sense to them. So they decided to call the manufacturer to confirm if what this risk officer, Amy Lund, was actually telling them was true. And when they called him up, he would gasp and he would tell them that the Pyxis machine is like a computer. You can retrieve as much data historically about what was given as you want. So what Amy Lund was telling them was actually false. So the detectives would get a bit agitated by this, and they would call Amy back up, and they would actually threaten her with getting the FBI involved to confiscate all of the hospital's Pyxis machines and do an FBI forensic investigation about what the data was in there. Of course, the hospital did not want the FBI involved, and they didn't want to lose their Pyxis machines. So with a few phone calls, Amy got that information that she said she didn't have right away to the detectives. Upon reviewing Charles Cullen's Pyxis report about what medication that he ordered from the machine, they found something a little suspicious. They found that in the case of digoxin as well as other medications, he had numerous cancellations on what he had ordered. So basically, he would go into the machine and type in his order, hit enter, and the drawer would pop open. He would grab the medication that he wanted, and then he would quickly hit the cancellation button. When a doctor makes a mistake and orders a medication they didn't actually want, they hit the cancellation button, and the machine still records it. It's still in there, and it's listed as a cancellation. But this is kind of a flaw in the machine in the sense that he was getting medications and beating the Pyxis machine by hitting the cancellation buttons. Now, the cancellation buttons on a report is going to seem like a mistake, like he had ordered the wrong thing and quickly canceled. Now, a quick inventory check, checking what medication was in there versus what was ordered, including the cancellations, could have probably figured this out. The detectives actually had some concrete evidence for once instead of hearsays and rumors that they had before. They had Mr. Cullen accessing the medications that they were actually investigating. But in order to secure a conviction with the jury, in most cases want something physical as evidence. So they want the syringe that he used, or they want the contaminated IV bag or something of that nature to really drive the conviction home to make sure that they actually get it. And they didn't yet have that.
And what was your intent when you went through this? Why were you drawing this out?
My intent was to give it to the Reverend Gall
For what reason?
so he would pass away.
Okay. Is there any reason you selected Reverend Gall to do this for?
He was, from my understanding, terminal. His systems were failing, meaning his kidneys, his liver, and I believe neurologically he had suffered some sort of stroke, meaning he wasn't responsive. I'm not sure neurologically if that was the case, but he hadn't been responsive, whether it be medications or a stroke, for quite some time.
Every day that Mr. Cullen would work would be a chance that he could possibly kill another person, and the chances of that happening were very high, so they're very concerned. They would actually phone the Somerset Hospital and pressure them into getting him fired for whatever type of reason. The hospital would actually comply and listen to this, and they found an infraction on his initial employment resume about the dates that he had worked prior in his work history, and they used that as the reason to fire him. With Mr. Cullen fired from the hospital, the detectives thought that that would be a great time to go into the hospital and to interview all of the employees to find out what they know. Upon doing so, they would find out that Amy Lund, the risk department manager, would be sitting in on every single interview. The detectives did not like this because imagine you're sitting in an interview with a detective about a case at the hospital you work at, and your boss is sitting right next to you. The boss has already not been cooperating with the detective, so you're not going to be privy to saying all of the information you might have. You're going to be saying only what your boss wants you to say, so they're not going to be risking their jobs and their livelihood to give out information freely. Regardless, the interviews would go on, and the last person to be interviewed was a friend of Charles Cullen. This was the lead nurse named Amy Loughren. Now, like all employees before her, Miss Lund, the risk manager, had coached her on what to say to the detectives to try to persuade the conversation, most likely. Amy Loughren considered Charles to be a good friend, and he had helped her out in numerous occasions. So in the interview with the detectives who were asking questions about Charles, and Charles had just previously been fired recently, she was very agitated with the detectives. In one particular instance, Amy would describe how Charles had helped her. Now, Amy had a condition called cardiomyopathy, and that would leave her heart feeling like it was beating out of her chest, and in some cases, this disease and condition can actually be fatal. One day, Amy was having one of her episodes from her condition, and she almost passed out and almost fell to the floor. It would actually be Charles who would come, scoop her up, and come to her rescue and bring her to a room to talk to her about what was going on. Now, he told her that you need to go straight to an emergency room, and she said, I can't. I got to keep working. I can't take time off. I can't risk losing my job. Charles would actually find some way to get her the medication that she needed in that instance to calm her heart down. And he would also take care of her shift and take care of all of her patients for that day so that she could relax. This would help her out tremendously, and he would actually keep her secret by not telling anyone about her condition because she didn't want to get fired from her job. She also referred to Charlie as an excellent nurse because he was an expert at medication, and all the nurses would go to him for advice specifically on medication. So naturally, she was very agitated that Charlie had been fired and detectives were investigating him for all of these instances. But by a stroke of luck, Miss Lund, the risk officer that was sitting in on the interview, was called out for some reason. She had to leave the interview. So the detectives decided to take a chance, and he would slide the Pyxis report for Charlie across the table for Amy to look at. She picked it up and looked at it, and since she was an expert and did this for a living, she quickly found some irregularities and was very concerned about what the printout had read, particularly the medication that was being pulled as well as the very high number of cancellations on what he pulled out. She would actually even say there was something sinister about the report, and she knew it right away. So the detective would actually mouth the words, "Will you help me?" to Amy to try and recruit her because they were in dire need of getting help on this case because of the multiple roadblocks that the risk department was putting in front of them during the hospital investigation. She actually would end up helping the detectives, and they came over to her house to speak with her personally. Now, this was the day after the interview, and Amy Lund, the risk officer, would call Amy Loughren at her home, which was very weird. This had never happened. And she would ask her, "Have you been talking to the detectives after the interview?" And she would advise her very sharply, do not talk to detectives without some representative from the hospital with you. Amy thought that that was a further red flag that there was possible wrongdoing. So she helped the detectives anyway and risked her job, and she would be the eyes and the ears and the person on the inside to help them with this investigation. And she would start to recount and think about instances where she had worked with Charlie because now she was in a different frame of mind. And she recalled one instance where she walked in on Charlie with a syringe giving a patient something. She asked him what it was, and he said lidocaine. For a split second, she said, she thought it was very odd that he was giving her lidocaine, and it made no sense. She quickly got over it because the patient was coding and they were giving her CPR. Now, eventually the doctor came in and got in tune with the situation and said to her, who gave her lidocaine? Where she lied about it and said it was her because she was the lead nurse and she took responsibility. But the doctor said that she was actually allergic to lidocaine. As she reflected on it, she realized that she had walked in on Charlie actually trying to murder somebody, and she didn't see it there when she accepted responsibility for the situation. As she was helping detectives, she would ask him if they had these Cerner files. And these Cerner files are the actual patient documents about what they're being given at the hospital. They didn't have those, and they didn't even know anything about them. So she would risk her job in that instance to go to the hospital when no one was looking and print out reams and reams of patient documents to help support the investigation. And again, she would risk her job for this.
Charlie, what we'd like to first bring up, the first instance we'd like to bring up with you, you understand you've been charged with 2 crimes, correct?
Murder and attempted murder.
Murder and attempted murder. Do you understand, or do you know who the victims of both those charges refer to?
I do now. I didn't know the second one until you told me a little while ago.
Okay, and that was a woman whose name is Miss Han?
That's correct.
Jin Han, I believe it is?
Yes.
Okay, and that was a charge of attempted murder.
That's correct.
Now, you were also charged with homicide, murder.
Yes.
And that charge is a result of the death pertaining to Florian Gal.
That's correct.
Okay. So you're clearly aware of that, correct?
Yes, I am.
Okay.
Getting down to the wire, they actually needed more evidence to convict Charlie beyond what they already had. So decided to try and exhume the bodies of some of the victims, and they chose Miss Helen Dean as well as Pastor Gall to exhume their bodies with their consent of the families. Upon doing so, they would find that even though those deaths had occurred months ago, they still had high amounts of digoxin in their bodies beyond what was reasonable. This, along with the Cerner patient record printouts and the Pyxis reports, they were starting to build their evidence, but you typically only have one shot to convict somebody, so they didn't know if they had enough. They decided to throw a long bomb by recruiting Amy, Charles's friend, to try to wear a wire to get him to confess on the wire to her. So they were running out of time because Charles had informed Amy that he had actually gotten a new job that he was pretty happy about. So trying to get this confession was very important. So she called Charles up and said, let's meet to celebrate your new job and we'll meet at a restaurant. And when they met at that restaurant for her to try and get that confession, she said that she was extremely scared when he reached in for a hug for the first time. She was scared that he would actually feel the black box taped to her back that was connected to the wire that she was trying to get him to confess to. But the wire actually went dead, so they couldn't get any type of confession, and the detectives could not record or hear anything. So that was a complete bust. But they didn't have any time left because surely with his new job, he was going to hurt somebody else at that new place. So they decided to go ahead and arrest him, and they picked him up and took him to the interrogation room. So they tried to get their own confession there, but Charlie wouldn't budge. He wouldn't tell him anything, and he just curled up into a ball and just stopped talking. The detectives' bosses that were sitting behind the reflective glass in the interrogation room said, that's enough, you've had enough time, he's not going to confess. So the detectives were very distraught about this, but they came up with an idea as their one last shot, and they did something extremely out of the ordinary, and they called Amy up and actually brought her into the interrogation room to try to get the confession out of Charlie because, again, they were friends and Charlie talked to her. This is extremely irregular, and it might seem like a scene out of a movie, but this is based on a true story. So she goes into the interrogation room to try to get the confession out of her friend Charlie. And she says this in so many words. Charlie, my life as I know it is completely changed because I have been implicated in this investigation. And you get to save me, Charlie. You get to be the hero. Right now, I just want to know one question. How did you kill Pastor Gall? And to that effect, Charlie would confess and tell her that I overdosed him with digoxin. And from that point, the investigators would pull Charlie out of the interrogation room, put him in another room with them, and send Amy away, and they would tell Charlie, okay, it's time to tell us everything now. And Charlie, in a plea deal so as to not get the death penalty, would confess to his crimes and would estimate the amount of deaths that he had been responsible for to be around 30 to 40 or more. Charles Cullen would estimate that he had killed at least 40 people in his 16-year career that expanded around 9 different hospitals, and he attempted to kill even more. Now, Charles would admit that initially in the beginning, he was feeling very overwhelmed by all of the death and misery and pain that he was experiencing working as a nurse. So in the beginning, it was a mercy kill because he didn't want to see people suffering. But of course, we know that a lot of the instances he killed people that were in the road to recovery or were about to be discharged. So in those cases, it certainly wasn't. They would ask him about his choice in using digoxin, and he would say that digoxin would take a series of hours to work so that he wouldn't even be in the room, and it would take effect so that it wouldn't arouse suspicion in him being around there. This was not the only method that he used, however. They typically store IV bags in an inventory room that the nurses can just get out. He would go into that room and inject bags with insulin. The nurses, as they would need them for patients, would go into that room, retrieve an IV bag, and they would be the delivery vehicle in delivering this poison to the patients, and the patients would overdose on insulin and pass away. Now, I use this method, again, to avoid arousing suspicion by using a different nurse to deliver this poison. How could a man commit so many murders in such a public place with so many eyes on him? The answer to that is actually maybe the most frightening part of all. The hospitals that Charles worked at previous to Somerset actually did know what was going on, but they did not want to risk the liability for that. If it got out that a nurse or a doctor was actually committing murders at this particular hospital, now this hospital is employing them, so they're going to be opening themselves up to being sued by patients for committing these murders. The hospitals that Charles worked at previous to Somerset actually did know what was going on. And they tried to cover it up because they did not want to risk their liability in getting sued for the instance. Because a hospital is going to be the one employing that nurse. If that nurse is committing murders, then it is opening up the hospital to getting sued by the patients. And of course, that opens up questions for everything that goes on in the hospital. So deaths that occurred at that hospital that are completely unrelated are going to also be opened up to investigation and possibly be getting sued. And not to mention, criminal charges against the hospital could be a possibility. The nurse that had put it all together at a hospital prior to Somerset that worked with Charlie, nobody listened to her at that hospital. And allegedly the reason behind that was they were in the middle of an expansion and they were building a new location. Now they needed to borrow a lot of money to build that location. So one of the requirements in borrowing that money is they had to disclose any type of lawsuits that were going on. So it was alleged that probably the reason why they didn't want to deal with the whole situation was they didn't want to risk not being able to expand into that new location by dealing with the Charlie situation. So it was much easier for them to just give him a good resume and a good recommendation letter and send him on his way. If the word on the street is that if you go to a particular hospital and there's a high risk of death in going, then nobody's going to want to go. And doctors aren't going to send their patients there, and therefore that hospital is going to lose a lot of money. Charles Cullen was convicted of 29 different murders, and he received 18 consecutive life sentences. Being a nurse at a hospital would give you a lot of access to a lot of patients that are in critical condition, as well as access to drugs to commit these types of murders. Some experts actually estimate his total victim count to be at 400. Now, regardless, at 29, this makes him the most prolific serial killer in American history. Because of this case, New Jersey would pass the Cullen Law, which requires hospitals to disclose impairment, misconduct, as well as incompetence to authorities. It also requires these hospitals to disclose these facts to future employers. If you want to know more about this case, there is a book called The Good Nurse that's written about it, as well as a Netflix movie called The Good Nurse and a Netflix documentary called Catching the Killer Nurse. Now that's going to do it for today, guys. I appreciate you listening, and I will catch you on the next one.